that some of us were in Iran leading up to 1979, 78 and 79 maybe hasn't been told in this way before. But I'm going to start with the first paragraph of the Shahnameh in English to put it in a little context. What does the Persian poet say about the first man to seek the crown of world sovereignty? No one has any knowledge of those first days, unless he has heard tales passed down from father to son. This is what those tales tell. The first man to be king and to establish the ceremonies associated with the crown and throne was Kayumars. When he became lord of the world, he lived first in the mountains where he established his throne. And he and his people dressed in leopard skins. It was he who first taught men about the preparation of food and clothing, which were new in the world at that time. Seated on his throne, as splendid as the sun, he reigned for 30 years. He was like a tall cypress tree, topped by the full moon, and the royal fire shone from him. All the animals of the world, wild and tame alike, reverently paid homage to him, bowing down before his throne, and their obedience increased his glory and good fortune. The Persian Book of Kings thus begins. So, we have a very interesting program for you. The way this is going to work, the sequence of speakers will first be Charlie Mitchell. Second will be Roger Nix. Third, Rob Stewart. Fourth, Steve Fairbanks, who has this slideshow that's behind me. The first slide is up here behind us. And finally, Bert Rice. So I'll tell a little bit about each person as we get started. My own story is that I was in Iran in 1973 and 74 and was there as a teacher of English in Mahala, which is exactly where Charlie and Marie Mitchell were. As a matter of fact, I just met them 2 days ago, but we met on Facebook and have had some conversations. But I learned maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years ago that there was another person who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Mahala. And all these years I kind of thought, wow, that was the end of the Mahala thing. But they came in, lived there for a year after I was there, and then they left, got graduate degrees, and then they came back and lived in Iran. So Charlie is going to tell their story to begin with. I left in the middle of the summer in 74, unintentionally. I had planned to go back. I had all my things in the apartment and had a nervous breakdown while traveling in Italy. We took buses out. I took a bus on my own through Turkey to Greece. I met up with some friends of mine in Greece. We traveled over to Italy, went to Rome, went to Florence, and I had a paranoid schizophrenic psychotic episode. It lasted for about 3 months. I was evacuated, I think, by the American military. They got me from Italy up to, I think it was Frankfurt, somewhere that way. And back, I was in a hospital in Savannah, Georgia for a couple of months. I had shock treatments and completely came out of that at that time. Kind of had a lot of decompressing to do. But then I went 30 or 40 years, and maybe 5 or 6 years ago, this group got started, which was really cool to start learning about some of the things that had gone on after I left so abruptly. So with that, let me introduce Charlie. Charlie got his master's in ESL at Arizona State University.
SIT. School for International Training.
Thank you, School for International Training. Okay, I'm going to let Charlie tell his story. I made some pretty scribbly notes here. He did run coffee houses for 23 years at Arizona State. He was the owner of this series of coffee houses. So, Charlie.
Skip, the portable mic is on the table.
So the Fairbanks doesn't want
I'm going to try to relate just a number of experiences that we had in Iran relating to the revolution. The revolution got off the ground in January 1978 with a disturbance in Tabriz. Roger knows a bit more about that than I do, but it took a period of time before we even heard about it in Esfahan, where I was working. Marie and I both, and Roger, worked for Telemedia in Esfahan. Telemedia was a subcontractor to Bell Helicopter, and there were like 10,000 employees in Esfahan, a huge contract. In December of 1977, December 14th to be exact, we had a son. And I dare not talk very much about my son, because 10.5 months later, he also died in Iran. So don't ask me any questions about relating to my son. But anyway, right after Michael was born, our friends from our Peace Corps site, the Rezai family, Mr. and Mrs. Rezai came down and wished us well. They were a family that we were extremely close to over the time that we were in Iran. And to this day, even yesterday, we had posted a photograph on Facebook, and 2 of the people from the family liked the photograph. It was a photograph of myself, Marie, Roger, and another volunteer that's not here, Steve Hosmer. So we're still in regular contact with this family. Anyway, the Rezais, Mr. and Mrs. Rezai came with us on a trip to the United States in January 1978. When we returned to Esfahan, the revolution had begun. It took a matter of months before we realized anything else about the revolution. And we only noticed because occasionally when we were coming home from work at the Army Air Corps base, we'd look down the street and see tires burning. Nothing big and nobody killed, but a symbol of the start of the revolution. That was in the summer, like maybe July of '78. And then, little by little, the Mujahideen, university students, religious forces, and a number of other groups in Iran started protesting as well. In fact, once in September, right at the end of September, I was in the bazaar in Esfahan. And I was bargaining for some cloth to have a lahaf made. We had a beautiful piece of Esfahani cloth for the center part of the lahaf, but we needed the material. And I was standing there bargaining for the cloth. And in the distance I could hear chanting, but it was still maybe 100, 150 yards away. And I continued to bargain, and then the sound got closer and closer, and finally I could see the people, but for some reason I kept bargaining because the price wasn't low enough yet. And so we agreed on a price, and by that time they were maybe 15, 20 feet away from me. I gave him the money quickly, grabbed the material, and got the heck out of there. Well, that night, there were like between 80 and 100 people killed in the bazaar that Meidun Shah. It's no longer called Meidun Shah, by the way. And then November 1st happened. Uh, 39 years ago tomorrow. I'm not going to bother to say what happened. It took us 6 days before we got out of the country. There was an airstrike going on in Iran at the time. And so we were forced to be driven to Tehran. And for some silly reason, the driver that they gave us had never been in Tehran. I'd never met an Iranian who had never been in Tehran before. So anyway, this fellow was driving us to Tehran, and the Rezai family had made arrangements for us to stop and visit them on the way out of the country. And so we gave the driver instructions as to how to get to Mahala. Drive to Dilijan, hang a left, go 25 kilometers, and there's Mahala. We arrived in Mahalot at the Rezai home. They welcomed us. They had been down to Esfahan actually a few days before that to see us after our losing our son. And we had a great lunch. And Mr. Hashimi was there as well. Mr. Hashimi had been mayor of Mahalot for 15 years. He was responsible for everything beautiful in Mahalot. Skip.
Piped water.
Like he had had engineers connect pipes to the spring. They had a beautiful, amazing amount of water coming out of the side of the mountain up above Mahalot. Every yard in Mahalot had running water going through it. Just a gorgeous place. And he also had tall sycamore trees planted that were mature trees by the time I got there. But anyway, so we were talking with Mr. Hashimi and Mr. Rezai, and they said, "Ma az abgusht khaste shodim, mekham chelo kebab bokhorim." So they don't want to eat abgusht anymore. They want chelo kebab. In other words, they saw that they recognized the need for a revolution, and they wanted change. Unfortunately, the change that happened in Iran was not the change that most thinking Iranians wanted. Anyway, we continued on from Mahalot to Tehran, and the driver again didn't know where he was going, so I said, we need to go up Pahlavi Street. And we started at Pahlavi. We were still in southern Tehran, and suddenly we found ourselves in the middle of a huge protest, burning buildings, and in fact they turned the car over right in front of us. And I was wearing a black leather jacket. We still have that black leather jacket. Has a hood on it. And I didn't want them to recognize me as an Anglo-American. So anyway, the driver, I said, I think you need to go Dasti Chap. Let's go to the left. And we saw some soldiers over there, and we knew the soldiers would take care of us. And so they said, yes, go west until you get to south of Mehrabad Airport, and then go north to the, I'm sure all of you noticed the huge grand edifice, Adi Amer or whatever, Freedom Square now, and it has like maybe eight streets going out from it. So we reached that finally after some difficulty. We had a truck ran into the side of our car that we were going, and we didn't know what to do for sure, but no insurance companies to call, so we kept on going. And we needed to go to where a friend of mine lived, former Peace Corps volunteer, John Halpin, who's now dead. John was waiting on us to arrive, and it was starting to get late in the day. At 8 o'clock, you had to be home. You had to be, you couldn't go out. Curfew, hukumat nizami. And I need to finish up. Somebody said time. Anyway, we made it to the Rizai house. We made it to our friend's house, John Halpin. The next day we found out that our son's body had been taken to the airport, but they weren't accepting anything over 25 kilos. So John Halpin was able to get a car from Raytheon that he worked for, and we went to the morgue where they were holding our son's body. It was in the same location as the protest the day before. Fortunately, no protest that day. We retrieved his body. We got some workers from, well, it was in a little coffin, and we went to Raytheon headquarters, and some Korean workers that worked for Raytheon built a little plywood box to fit out around it so it was not so recognizable as a coffin. We went back to John's house. The next morning, went to the airport. Fortunately, they were not checking baggage visually. So they weren't opening anything and looking at it, because we had one box that we weren't going to let anybody look into. Anyway, we got on the airplane, French Air. Swiss Air. And Marie found a 5-franc note, and so we thought, for sure, a coin. So we were sure that our luck had finally changed. And that's my story.
Thank you, Charlie and Marie. Roger Nix lives out in Washington State. He's a third-generation Washingtonian, graduate of UW, as they know it. He's Peace Corps volunteer 74 to 76, and then was living in Esfahan 76 to 78. Worked for Bell Helicopter Telemedia, and he has had a long career teaching in community college. Roger.
Good morning, everybody. I'd just like to start off by saying I was a very lucky guy. The last 2 years I worked in Iran. I came home from Peace Corps for a few months, and then I was hired by a Chicago-based company called Telemedia, and I went back to Iran to teach flight-related English to Iranian Army helicopter pilots at the big helicopter base in Isfahan. And I was a classroom teacher for 1 year, and then the second year, in 1978, I became a flight line tutor. So I used to actually fly in the helicopters with the students and note their language difficulties, and then when they were on the ground during breaks, I would work on their language, and that's what I did for the rest of 1978 professionally. But the trouble started in Iran in January 78 in Tabriz with some rioting, and it was finally quelled. And then later there was another demonstration in Qom, and the security forces there killed quite a few people. And that started this cycle of martyr parades every 40 days, because apparently in Shia Islam, they commemorate the deaths or martyrdom of an individual 40 days after they were killed. And this cycle just continued. And at first, it didn't really affect us too much in Isfahan, but by the spring of '78, then things started to hit the fan, so to speak. And by June, it got so bad with liquor stores and cinemas being firebombed that the government imposed a curfew on us. And the curfew initially was from 8 o'clock at night till 6 o'clock in the morning. So by 7:30, the streets were deserted. And it was pretty strange to see this, because Isfahan was a very bustling city when we were there. So anyway, then if you were invited to somebody's house for dinner, you basically spent the night there. You just pull up, sleep on the couch or on the floor or any available space. But during this time, life continued on as normal for us. I went to work every day. I played softball on the company softball team. There was a big league in Isfahan, and we played on the weekends. In fact, my mother came to visit with her younger sister, my aunt, and they were there in, let's see, it was in early June of 1978. And things were starting to get a little bit tense, but the visit went by very well. And then by August, it started getting really violent again. And so the government or the military had set up patrols, and also they had soldiers stationed at every major intersection. And in Isfahan, they had the Iranian army had an artillery school, so they would bring in their troops, their artillery troops with their self-propelled guns, and station these large self-propelled guns at the major intersections. And everybody was all excited because they said, boy, look at how big these guns are, but they weren't really designed for crowd control, but they really impressed the locals. So anyway, we continued playing softball. And then in October, a good college friend of mine flew over from London, where he was studying, and spent about 2 weeks visiting me in Iran. And the violence cycle at that point, it kind of dropped down, and so things were a little bit calmer. And so my friend and I toured all around Isfahan. We went down to Shiraz to Takhtu Jamshid for a visit, flew back, and then he left. And at the end of October, things started getting really exciting again. The Shah's birthday was October 26th, and as you know, the government used to commemorate his birthday with all kinds of celebrations and parades and things. Well, as it got closer to the Shah's birthday, then there were more demonstrations, there was more violence. I used to hear gunfire at night. I lived in the Abbasabad area of Isfahan, and although I didn't see any shooting in my neighborhood, I could hear gunfire in the distance. And then talking to my neighbors, they were telling me about people being shot, just a few streets down the road. So anyway, by November, we were experiencing a lot of strikes. It was hard to get mail in and out of the country. The newspapers went on strike, so it was hard to get local news. We were tuned into BBC to kind of get an idea of what was going on in Iran, because we had no idea. Now the curfew by this time, though, had been relaxed to, I think it was 10 o'clock at night to 5 in the morning. So you could be out a little bit later. In fact, when my friend and I flew down to Shiraz, we came back by bus. And because we got back to Isfahan before the curfew was up, we had to stop at the road police station and sit there and wait for a couple hours until the curfew had expired at 5 o'clock, and we could drive into town and go back to my place. I liked my job, so I signed up for a 3rd year with the company, and they gave me a home leave. So I was prepared to leave the country for 5 weeks, with the intent to return in January of '79. So on November 30th, I flew out of Isfahan to Tehran on airlines called Pars Air, because Iran Air was on strike so much of the time that they weren't reliable about getting out. So Pars Air, which was a private company, was pretty reliable to have with their service out of Isfahan. So I flew to Tehran, got to Tehran, Mehrabad. I took a flight out to Bangkok. I flew across the Pacific back home. I was in the States for a brief home leave. I flew across back the Pacific, going back to Tehran. I got as far as Bangkok, and there I discovered that we could not return to Tehran. The airlines were all over flying Iran because of the violence there. I started running into colleagues from Isfahan and also some Bell Helicopter people that had known there. And we all heard you can't get back to Iran. So the upshot was Bell Helicopter flew a representative out from Texas, gathered us all together, and then bought blocks of seats on commercial flights back to the States. And that's what happened to me. I flew back to the States, went back home, and my company offered me the generous option of flying back to Iran at my own expense. I called my friends in Isfahan and they said, what should I do? And they said, don't come back, Roger. Things are going to end here pretty soon. We only go to work maybe once a week. The Iranians are turning against us. It's cold. It's hard to get kerosene to heat our homes. The bazaar's closed a lot, so it's hard to get food. Forget coming back. So I said, okay. So I called the company. They said, all right, we're going to terminate you. And that was the end of my job in Tehran, or in Iran. Oh, I wanted to mention that when I was leaving Iran, I tried to repatriate as much of my money as I could. And they had currency exchange because so many Iranians were sending money out of the country that the government became very alarmed. And so they had a limit about how much you could convert from reals into dollars. And they actually would write this down in your passport. So when I was leaving, they only allowed me to exchange $2,800. And so I had lots of reals left over, and I said, what should I do? And I talked to some friends, and they said, buy gold coins. And so that's what I ended up doing. And I kept them in a safe deposit box for literally decades. And then when my son was a university student, I used them to help pay for his college education. So I sold all these gold coins at a coin dealer shop in Seattle and Bellevue. And
Closer to the microphone.
Oh, closer to the microphone. Can you hear me okay? So, so anyway, I sold all those gold coins and helped pay for my son's education. And you know, I want to say this: that the time I was in Iran, the Iranians were never hostile towards me. Of course, I tried to keep a low profile, but there was a lot of violence going on, but it was never directed towards any of us as foreigners. And so that I appreciate, but it was a very exciting time, and fortunately, I was not negatively impacted. So, thank you for your.
Thank you, Roger. Next up is Rob Stewart. Rob was in the Peace Corps. Okay, so hoping I get this right, Rob, but worked for Fluor, F-L-U-O-R company, went to Venezuela, returned home to L.A. In 1993, went into business on his own as a general contractor. And I'm sure I've missed some of the details you gave me a few minutes ago, but you can. Thanks. Thanks.
All right. The sum total of my public speaking consists of ordering a drink and a loud honky tonk. So kind of bear with me on this. All right, 78 was the year that it kind of started getting Iran, or New Year's of that year. Jimmy Carter and Showers had a New Year's party. Like Roger said, the curfew started, so then after that, we kind of sat at home. I didn't have any of these other experiences they did. Mine was kind of timid. I remember the curfew, me and my wife sitting there watching TV, whatever. We would ride a bus back and forth to the refinery. And then as the job wound down, we were going cars. One day I decided to drive another volunteer, a guy named John Cube. And we decided to go get a haircut. I was really not aware of all of the things that were happening. I didn't see anything. People were talking about fires and things like this. Once in a while you would hear a gunshot or something anyway. So anyway, we went to get this haircut, this little upscale barber shop. We had 4 barbers. 2 of them were like stand-up comedians. And they would tell jokes back and forth, and we were sitting there listening to them. And in walk a friend and it says, well, how you doing? Che Guevara, what's new? He says, no, not too much. you know, artist shoes you can. And I listened to what he said, and he repeated it again, you know, artist shoes you can. There's not too much burning going on today. I thought, geez, this is really going to be something. Shortly after that, they consolidated the expatriates to a place called Chane Isfahan. And the housing, we left our little palatial apartment, which was very nice. It's like a sort of a bungalow. It was a little, it was new, and it was nice. It had carpeting on the floor, 2 bathrooms. It was very nice. It was built, I think, for the oil people after the construction workers left. Anyway, there were 2 walls on both sides to separate you from your neighbor. You had a front yard, no big hayat in the front or anything. And the bathrooms had a skylight, which I remember. Well, one night we're sitting there with my wife, my little girl. She was born in Isfahan. And there's this beating on the door on this skylight. So I run in the bathroom. What the hell was this? So there's a guy out there just pounding away on it, you know. And so I go out front and look, and anyway, there's all these Americans out there. And they were saying, we're going into the manager's office and we're going to demand that we get out of here and blah, 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 blah. I'm going, you know, I mean, these are the people who came to my house and wore their shoes inside, and sucked up the Persian hospitality. And so we're going to demand this. And I said, well, okay, let me get my boots and I'll meet you right there. Okay, so their wives and there were a few children there, but not very many, but mostly the wives and some of these hardcore construction dudes. So they go, my wife says, what are we going to do? I said, you made Haresh June, I'm going to eat, you know, and then we're going to watch TV because Beretta's on tonight. We can hear it on the simulcast. And so she said, well, what's that all about? You know, and there wasn't a lot of news about Iran being shallud or anything. Just hearsay that I was hearing. And she didn't seem to be concerned. So anyway, 2 days later, they decide they're going to fly these people out. So they're putting this program together to get them out. And someone came and asked me from you know, the main office manager, construction manager, asked me to stay. I go, okay, I'll stay. No place else to go. And then I heard from somebody else in this same office that, you know, we're not taking any Persians out on the plane. And I go, oh, this is a little conflict here. So I called a friend of mine. He worked there. I said, hey, did you hear this? They're going to, you know, send the people home, but they're not taking any Iranians. And he goes, yeah, I heard the same thing. But my wife works for Northrop, and let me call her. So she called over there. She was an Iranian gal also. So anyway, it was arranged that my wife would go on the Northrop plane, okay, which, okay, lo and behold, became the same plane, which was okay. I didn't take any of this personal. So they get on the plane and leave. I neglected to even think my wife needed an exit visa, so I guess this held the process up a little bit. So anyway, they leave. I don't know anything about the exit visa for, I don't know, a couple of weeks, a month maybe. So they're gone. I live in my house. About 2 days later, someone shows up and says, hey, we're going to pack your stuff up. And I said, okay, that's cool. And then they put the carpets and stuff and samovars and all the little art stuff we bought in Iran. And they're great, and I assume this is the last time we're going to see any of this. So then we move into the refinery. So at that point, living in the refinery in the office was kind of okay, because everybody who was left was really a hardcore expat. They'd been doing this for years and years and years. One gentleman had told me, you know, he says, I never go anywhere. He says, I always go back. You know, and I thought this was a pretty good statement. So we stayed there, we stayed occupied. We kept hearing more stories of things happening. I wasn't seeing any of this. I got a tooth infection, a root canal. One of the office managers, he was a German guy. He knew a German dentist in Isfahan. Said that, you know, I made an appointment, you can go in the middle of the day. So we go. The driver drives me down to Isfahan. He drops me off. And all the storefronts were, you know, the sliding doors they have in the fronts of their stores was all closed. I didn't really think much of it. So I go in, I sit in a chair, and you know how you do and everything, you know. And all of a sudden, his nurses are getting all excited. He's getting all excited. And I guess there was a riot coming down the street. So he says, well, we have to, you know, I said, wait a minute, I'm in pain here. This hurts, you know. So he pulls out the notebook and gives it to me. I said, well, it's not attacking. He says, well, we got to go. The nurses had gotten their purse, their doors, all their stuff on. So anyway, out comes a tooth with a little groan. He hands me the largest jar of antibiotics, and it's equal size of painkillers. You know. So out the door I go, still got the blood dripping. There's just some cotton in him. The driver had pulled the car, back the car up into, you know, it was like those little shopping mall kind of places, you know, that little U kind of thing. Oh, excuse me. So anyway, he backs up there, and I said, well, this is really different. So I get in, he tells me to get down. I said, well, why? My jaw hurts. I don't want to bend over. And he said, no, get down, get down, get down. They're coming. So anyway, he pulls out, and I saw what he was referring to, this huge crowd coming down the street. So we're speeding away the other way. And we get back to the refinery. You know, I take my pills. Everything is fine. The next day, I'm working a little bit. And then they decide that we hear this rumor that Khomeini is coming back to Iran. And at the time, I really never paid attention to who Khomeini was. But anyway, long story short there, he came back, and then it was decided that the Americans should leave. So we got on, went to the airport, we drove a car there, left it in Esfahan, at some airport. I don't know which airport it was, really. But it wasn't the main one down in Esfahan. Maybe it was a military base or whatever. We got on the plane, and I remember there was other Americans leaving. I also remember one couple was on the plane, and they like started freaking out when we started to leave because their dog didn't make the baggage compartment, so they got off the plane. I don't know. Damn. Okay. So anyway, fly home, unemployment, bought a house. I had another baby. My second daughter was born. I worked a couple of menial jobs. Anyway, I got a phone call one day. He said, you want to go back to Iran? And I, well, I'm going to have to think about this long and hard. Yes. And I said, well, you're going to have to go back on a single status. And I said, okay. That was probably the beginning of the end of something there. So I go back to Iran. I got there back in, I think it was August of '79, something like that. And we had left in February or March of '79, back again. Things were kind of the same, but different. When you go back someplace, you really know how it is, and it hasn't changed that much. You feel comfortable, you feel fine. So we went back in, started living in the refinery again, and then they had brought in a startup crew. Now these people weren't really hardcore construction people. They were used to going to a place and starting a refinery. They're more engineering and technical type. And to watch these people, they were all kind of excited in the beginning, but then after the embassy was captured, they all started freaking out, you know, acting strange and all concerned. Everybody had a theory of how we were going to be rescued. I didn't want to tell them, no, they're not going to land a C-130 up there on that hill and come get you. You know? I think you're basically going to be on your own. And so anyway, they started filtering people out. They were driving up to Tehran. And that was pretty uneventful too. I managed to hustle a case of beer, and I put it in a friend of mine's room. He had a refrigerator. So every night we'd go down there, we'd talk a little bit, drink a couple beers, but we limited it to two because we wanted this case of beer to last a while. So I went down there a couple nights later, and tapped on his door. He wasn't there. And I said, damn, okay. So I started looking around for him, and I asked a couple people, you see him? And they, no. And then it dawned on me, you know, they had slipped him out too. He had flown, left the refinery, was going back, you know. And you know, I wasn't upset seeing him, but he drank the beer. You know? So then the next thing we leave, it was going to be a mass exodus. The Germans were coming in to replace the Americans in the refinery. So they loaded everybody up in cars. They were like Chevy Impalas. And I was with one of the construction managers. We had a Chevy Blazer. It was a new one, a relatively new one. Anyway, we left. We were heading out, and we were going to drive to Tehran. Well, in those days, there was a difference between city tires and highway tires or country tires. So we were on the road about, I don't know, 30 minutes. We had a flat tire, so we changed it. About another half hour, we had another flat tire. And so then I said, well, okay, let me hitchhike up the road. I'll find a guy, tire store, the next town, come back. These people all freaking out, no, you can't leave us alone here, you know. I said, well, it's not a big deal. No one's going to bother you. So anyway, they didn't want to do that. So then these cars came by. So everybody got into one car, which overloaded it by one. But you know, Peace Corps, you could put 4 people in the front of a Gion. And so that wasn't a big thing. We went through Gome, and I wanted to buy some candy, and everyone was freaking out. So the driver explained to them that Gome was where Khomeini lived, a religious city in the country. Anyway, we lived up in, we got to the Hilton Tehran. That's when I saw all the activity, the bullet holes all over the hotel, and the walls. People were different, and pretty much it. So compared to these gentlemen, my story wasn't much. But anyway, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rob. Weren't you also on one of those buses that Bert is going to tell us about?
Which bus? No.
Okay. Okay.
No.
Okay. So our next presenter is Steve Fairbanks. Steve was actually in the Peace Corps in the 60s, but in the 80s and 90s he was with the State Department. He worked with Radio Free Europe and established the Persian language broadcasting service. And I'm going to let Steve go ahead with his presentation, and I'm going to run the slides for him.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I'm not able to stand up, so I'll have to do this sitting down. In 1977, we returned to Iran, my wife and 2 daughters and 2 dogs, and we lived 1 block below Shahrazad. If you remember geography of Tehran, Shahrazad was the street that became Eisenhower and went out to the airport. It was a relatively calm part of town during these times of troubles until one morning, November 5th, woke up to hearing a lot of banging and went outside. A block away was our bank, which had been broken into, and people were banging away on the safes. And then up the street, which was Koch, if you remember Koch, that went up to near the Peace Corps office. There were huge numbers of young men, I've never seen it in that part of town, who were attacking banks. Things have been completely calm until then. And so I have a few pictures of what was going on at that time. This is the intersection of it was Koch, I can't quite see right now, but you can see that they had blocked off the roads and were attacking banks. This was all very peculiar. There was no sloganeering, nothing Islamic about this. They were imported, all of these young men from somewhere, I don't know. Here is the bank on the corner of Shahrazad and Koch. This is another one that was attacked and things brought out and burned. Next one. Things got serious from my standpoint. This was a local beer delivery truck which had been attacked and all of the bottles strewn about. Next. At the corner of Pahlavi and Shahrazad's Charbahi Pahlavi, there was a huge liquor store run by Armenians. It was a wonderful place until that morning where all of the bottles were taken out and destroyed on the street. There was a young guy with Adidas outfit attacking some of the bottles of scotch. Another bank on Shahrazad, if they couldn't get to the safes, they at least took out all the computer printouts and set them afire. Next. Finally, this is Pahlavi Avenue on the morning of November 5th. And our first speaker, Charlie, mentioned going by bus up Pahlavi on that same morning and being surprised, going by car, and seeing a car overturned. The sign here, this is Pahlavi, it's completely deserted, and the sign that says victory to the national people's movement of Iran. There was nothing particularly Islamic about that. In chalk it says Mark Shah, that morning of November 5th, I've thought about it many times since then, about how strange it was that there were no police, no military, all of this was allowed to go on. And I think it was really intentionally done by the government so that that evening they could impose martial law more seriously than it had been before. And so with the attacks on banks and travel agencies, it now became a much more serious problem. The next big event, I think in Tehran anyway, was on Ashura on November, or it would have been December 11th that year, where there were huge crowds on their way to the monument that's now called Azadi, but was Shahyad at that time. Just the streets were packed. By my crude estimate, more than 1 million people. It was even bigger than Trump's inauguration. It was far and away the biggest crowds I've ever seen. All marching totally peacefully, calmly, and with permission, I guess, of the government. By that time, clerical leadership of the unrest was pretty clear. Some of the banners, stop at this one for a second, were being held up by Mujahideen Khalq, and at that time they were a very strong part of this whole thing. Clerics didn't like them, but they had quite a huge following with a popular song about a Mujahid that was sung by the girls in the parade here. And this banner shows, I believe, some of their own martyrs before nearly all of them became martyrs. Everyone was marching toward Shahid, and it was becoming more orchestrated. The fist raisings were in coordination. As we get up to the, this would be another Mujahideen sort of poster or banner being held up. Next. As we got to the Shahid Monument, they were now hoping for foreign media to show up, so they managed to point out the sins of the Shah, including being anti-people. Graffiti became increasingly common. They have these stencils. This is on the side of an apartment building. Stencils that would make for portraits of Khomeini. There were a couple of others shown here. Plus, there was one saying hello to the Mujahids. I'm moved now to the period after the revolution, in the first summer of '79. The first anti-U.S. demonstration, which I happened to be at the head of it, where they were reacting in anger to Senator Javits in New York, who had gotten a Senate, as you call it, a resolution condemning what was going on in Tehran. At that time, it was the execution of a prominent, wealthy Jew. And so they organized a demonstration against the U.S. It was the first time, where they said American senators are rubbers. They meant robbers. Regretfully, I regretted afterwards that I went and corrected their sign for them. Anyway, so stupid senators shut up. It's a huge demonstration that eventually got to the American embassy. Some of the slogans that you can see here about "We hate U.S. government" and so on. As we go on, an enormous demonstration of, first of all, guys in bell bottoms, and a separate women's section. That what I wanted to show in particularly in the demonstrations that went to the Shahid Mosque monument was that these demonstrations at that time, before the revolution, pretty much cut across all classes. This was not some takeover by mullahs in the way that Trump implied in his recent speech about Iran. It really was a very broad-based movement. So, are there any more pictures? Women were a huge part of this. And next, if I have just a few seconds left, in front of the American embassy, they wound up, the sign says, "The American government is the center of of all the plots of the world. The American embassy at that time was being protected, so to speak, by mujahideen who were standing on walls back then. And finally, a demonstration on Labor Day, I think it was about the only Labor Day demonstration that the Islamic government allowed. After that, they were eliminated as a separate movement. So that's it for the pictures.
Thank you so much.
I can confirm the young men setting buildings on fire because a lot of John Halpin and I saw a lot of their bodies on the 6th of November in the morgue. John kept saying, "Charlie, just look straight ahead. Don't look to the left or right." But I was okay. I lost my son. Nothing else could bother me.
Okay, this has been an incredible panel. What we're going to do after Bert speaks, and I'll introduce him shortly, is I'm going to turn the mic over. I have one person who also was here at the time. Where are you? We talked beforehand, and you're going to come up and tell your quick story. Who was that? Oh, yes, thank you. Okay, so I'll turn this over to you, and then we'll pass the mic around among people in the audience. And this panel, if they're responding to a question, will come up here to speak, and I'll need to get the mic back for Steve if we need to. So with this, Colonel Bert Rice is from Montana, goes home every summer, lives here in Odenton, close by. I know him because he is on our library board of trustees here. He was on our county council for a 4-year term in the 90s. He had a 30-year career in the United States Army. And then, if you all remember the BRAC program, Base Realignment and Closure Program, well, Fort Meade became a major beneficiary of that. A lot of things like Cyber Command, NSA was already there. At any rate, Bert, in his retirement, became the civilian commander, essentially the director of the transformation of Fort Meade. He was there in Iran from January 12th of 1979. Until I believe his birthday, February the 20th of 1979, and then I think the next day he left. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bert.
In the military, why we have to have training aids. So these are my training aids, and I'll share those with you in just a minute. I am Bert Rice. I had a tour of duty in Iran during, as Skip said, I arrived there about the 12th of January 1979, and it's fortuitous for me that all of these gentlemen spoke prior, because they gave a good background of what the situation was when I arrived in Iran. So, and a little background in preparation for the tour in Vietnam. I was assigned there by the Army, of course, and received orders, was sent to Eglin Air Force Base for a 3-day orientation of the culture and that sort of thing, and to sort of find out what we were getting into. Not a long period of time, but it was helpful as I later recalled that information. I was then sent to Fort Rucker, Alabama for a refresher training in helicopter flight, as well as I gained a instructor pilot's rating at that time. And then I went back to Fort Meade, and Fort Meade is just close. It's only about 15 miles west of Annapolis, and I've had a number of assignments there at Fort Meade, as was mentioned. Well, then I did leave Baltimore, flew to Kennedy Airport for a flight to Tehran. When I arrived there, they said, well, we can't get you into Tehran, the airspace has been closed. I said, this is not starting off well. And they said, well, we could either send you to London, and you could wait there for flight or you can get on a flight, it'll take you to Rome, and then something may take place after that. I said, I've got to get to Tehran. My order said I was to do that. So I got on the flight to Rome. We had a stop over there, and then took off, and they said, well, the airspace is still closed. So we flew to Karachi, Pakistan, and had an overnight there in there. And it was, I remember very clearly, it was very hot and damp there. And we didn't get into any places to sleep and that sort of thing. But then they said, load the plane. So we were on a 747 all this time. So we got back on, and they said, it looks like we can get in. And about an hour later, the pilot came on and said, we can't get into Tehran. We're going to take you to Istanbul. So we arrived in Istanbul. They did put us up overnight. Then the next morning we got up early, and then we were able to finally arrive in Tehran. So I processed through, as is custom, for anyone arriving, as far as the Army was concerned. We had an Army section there in Tehran. And my assignment then would be in Esfahan. So after processing in through and doing the necessary administrative work, I was flown to Tehran in a C-12, which is a twin-engine aircraft flown by the Air Force. And when I arrived, I found it interesting because there were 3 cars there to meet me, and I said, wow, this is going to be interesting. And I said, okay, and I introduced myself to my team and a few others that were in the area. And they said, we're not going to the team house. And I said, oh, where are we going? They said, we're going to go and do a reconnaissance of routes for evacuation of Americans out of Isfahan. And I said, very interesting. And while I was assigned to Tehran as a team chief for a technical assistance field team, with my duty being to support, our team was to support a general support aviation company or group there in Isfahan. And in Isfahan was the Iranian aviation training center as well. And there was another aviation group there. So when you arrived out at the airport, there were helicopters everywhere. And one gentleman mentioned BHI, Bell Helicopter International. That'll come into play later in my presentation. And I'm very thankful for BHI for what they did for us later. We did work with a number of firms there in Isfahan to evacuate their personnel out of there. And what was stated about the protests and that, they happen frequently. And I was amazed that it could be quiet. And in about 3 minutes' time, you could have thousands in the streets of Isfahan. And Tehran, I think, was similar. They were very organized from that standpoint. We did maintain close contact with the consulate there in Isfahan. The person that was in charge there at that time was David McGaffey. Some of you may know him, but it proved very beneficial for us later because he was communicating with the locals there in Isfahan as well as with the embassy in Tehran. I had 11 members on my team, and these members were qualified helicopter pilots as instructor pilots, standardization instructor pilots, and then maintenance officers, and we would work to support this aviation support group. And in that aviation group, there was a battalion of CH-47s, they were a large helicopter. There was a battalion of Cobra helicopters. And then there was another battalion of sort of a combination of Hueys that you've heard about that were used extensively in the Vietnam War. So that was sort of the makeup of our team. I mentioned that Bell Helicopter was the contracting firm to support the Iranian aviation training center there in Isfahan. And interestingly, my instructor pilot, when I went through flight school, was a fellow about this tall by the name of Rip Johnson. Talmadge Johnson was his name. He was a Navy pilot during World War II, and he'd been shot down twice during World War II. And then in his flights, he says the way we got out of the aircraft was we would tip it over and we'd fall out, bail out, and then be picked up at sea or wherever they happened to be at the time. But Rick Johnson and his wife were there in Isfahan, serving as instructors, working for Bell Helicopter for the students that they had in their Iranian aviation training program there. So I thought that was very interesting, and things go around, you know, they sort of come around. Now the Shah departed, oh boy, I've got to quickly get going here. The Shah departed late January. Khomeini came in on about the 1st of February, and the change was significant, to say the least. And so then, and what I have with me is a logbook, and it's a true copy of the logbook that we kept, starting with the 31st of January through the last day we were in Isfahan. And it tells by hourly basis all of the calls that were coming into us and that we were part of as it related to our status in Isfahan and in Iran at the time. Then on the, if I have this correct, on the 14th of February, Ambassador Sullivan and his staff were taken hostage, along with General Gast, who was in charge of the military there in Tehran. And so for a period of time, we did not know his status or situation. It became known later, but we got a call down country that said, if you have weapons, hide them. Do not wear your uniforms. We cannot support you either by air or land because all were closed off. So, being part of the greatest country in the world, I said to myself, this is a little difficult. But anyway, it was a challenging time. It was tense, not knowing exactly what was going to happen next. But in any case, we had moved from our team house in Isfahan out to Shanshar, where many of the employees lived of the American companies that were over there. So that all worked out well. We finally got approval to go into, to travel up to Isfahan. I went over to see formerly Colonel, now Mr. Huggins, who worked for Bell Helicopter, and there were like 10 buses lined up. And I said, I need your help. I need a bus to get, at that time we had a final number of 27 military personnel there in Isfahan. I need some transportation to Iran. He says, you see that last bus? You get your people here in 2 hours and you'll go with us tonight to Tehran. So we left at about 6 p.m. and each bus had an Iranian on it that could get us through all the checkpoints to Tehran, and we finally arrived at the Hilton in Tehran at about 3 o'clock in the morning on my birthday. And I said, I'll never forget that. And I'll just close with my other training aid. On the nose of the Pan Am aircraft that flew us out of Tehran, they had put this sign on the front of it. I came, I saw, I ran.
Hey, Bert, can you hold that up for a photo? I think that
Yeah. Hold it up.
Absolutely.
You might even stand in front of this screen here.
Camera.
I've only given this presentation 2 other times. The first was to a Protestant men of the chapel at Fort Meade, and my wife helped me put this together for that presentation. And the other time was at a Rotary Club meeting in Carson City, Nevada, when I was on an assignment out there. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Bert. Okay, we're going to do the Q&A part of this during the break because we need to stay on target with that. But there's two things. Carolyn Yale, president of Peace Corps Iran Association, wants to make an announcement. I want to do a quick reading. And these goodie bags that were put together by Bonnie Urban, take a bow, Bonnie, back there. We still have more of these, so if you didn't get enough snacks yesterday, be sure to pick some of these up. Okay, and Anise Odor. Is Anise here also? Not today. Okay. So I started with reading at the beginning of the Shahnameh. This is the end, and it's written by, of course, Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. So this is him speaking after he's written all this long story of the beginning of time up until basically 300 or 400 years into the time after the Hijrah and the Islamicization of the world that they knew. So just very quickly, after 65 years had passed over my head, I toiled ever more diligently and with greater difficulty at my task. I searched out the history of the kings, but my star was a laggard one. Nobles and great men wrote down what I had written without paying me. I watched from a distance, as if I were a hired servant of theirs. I had nothing from them but their congratulations. My gallbladder was ready to burst with their congratulations. Their purses of hoarded coins remained closed, and my bright heart grew weary at their stinginess. But of the renowned men of my district, Ali Dailami helped me, and that honorable man, Hossein Koteb, never asked for my works for nothing. I received food and clothing, silver and gold from him, and it was he who gave me the will to continue. I never had to worry about paying taxes and was able to wrap myself in my quilt in comfort. And when I reached the age of 71, the heavens humbled themselves before my verses. Now I have brought the story of Yazdegerd to an end in the month of September on the day of Ard, and 400 years have passed since the Hijrah of the Prophet. I've reached the end of this great history, and all the land will fill with talk of me. I shall not die. These seeds I've sown will save my name and reputation from the grave, and men of sense and wisdom will proclaim, when I have gone, my praises and my fame. Carolyn.